Thank you very much. I'm actually most proud of being titled Twerpy MIT Economist by John Oliver recently. Beats all those other words hands down. So before I get started, I'm actually going to have to depart shortly after this. I'm going to Australia, but not running away. But I just want to say thanks to a number of people. First, I want to say thanks to Toby Chicken, who did so much to organize this, as well as Marion Bates and the entire JPEL staff. I want to say thank you to Larry Katz, who's been our intellectual leader. I want to thank Anran Lee, who helped us did an enormous amount of work on the paper. I want to thank the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that has made a very generous donation to this initiative, as well as Rich and Jerry Wong, who made a private donation to this initiative. So I also just want to thank all of you for coming. This has been a really gratifying day. I'm just delighted by the kind of diversity of perspectives, the intellectual energy, and just it's very rare to see a convening of academics, people from the private sector, people from foundations, people who are activists, and people who are implementers within government, all sort of sharing the same objective and thinking constructively about a set of problems that we all care deeply about. So it's very inspiring, and I'm very excited about the potential of this initiative to stand up really good research that will be useful to us and useful to the people who were most attempting to create benefits for. So I'm just going to speak for about half an hour, and I just want to sort of set the stage of the what I think see as the changing texture of work in the United States, and the challenges and possible opportunities that creates. And I want to sort of start from the point of job polarization, a phenomenon that you've all heard about, or maybe heard about, and then put it in context of not as a macroeconomic phenomenon, but as a phenomenon closely tied to the changing geography of work, the changing allocation of workers by education across job types, and how the labor market has really shifted in a way that I think, at least that I didn't appreciate as much prior to doing this sort of just descriptive analysis. And then I want to link that not just to this type of jobs, but the wages those jobs pay, and then even the changing demographics of places. And finally, I want to talk about new work, and particularly, when people say new work, they're always talking about artificial intelligence. Everyone's going to be a bot herder or a machine learning specialist or so on. And I want to sort of point out how much new work is not that simple, and also comes with its own set of opportunities and challenges. So let me just start off. Many of you have seen figures that look like this, that show this kind of barbell shape of the growth of employment by occupation. These are 9 occupations ordered from low wage to high wage. So on the left-hand 3 are service occupations, jobs that involve assisting, caring for, helping others. So health and professional services, cleaning and protective services, then operators and laborers, sort of somewhere in between. Then we move next into production, office, administrative, and sales occupations. These are mostly middle wage, middle education jobs. And then finally, on the right-hand side, technical, professional, and managerial jobs, many of which require a college degree and pay relatively high wages and offer relatively high stability. And as you can see, this has kind of a U shape. This is the polarization phenomenon. And so we know there's been a lot of growth at the tails of this, and the decline in the middle is not mysterious. It has a lot to do with automation that has codified and replaced many office, clerical, administrative support tasks, and has also reduced employment in manufacturing through greater automation, augmented by trade. Now I want to collapse that down to just 3 categories, which I'm going to call, you'll forgive me, I should already have updated these slides today. I'm going to call them low wage, middle wage, and high wage. That word skill there, that actually spells wage. And you can see, so the left 3, the red bars are the service occupations, the orange bars are production office occupations, and the blue bars are these professional, technical, and managerial occupations. And you look at that and you say, oh, that polarization thing, that's not so obvious in this figure at all. It's mostly decline in the middle and rise in the top. So it's looks like, well, the middle class is shrinking because everyone's becoming upper class. Why would we worry about that? That doesn't look like a problem. So now I'm going to break this down further into college and non-college workers. So to be clear what that is, non-college means everyone has high school or lower education. and college means some college or above. Now, it's important to understand those are changing categories. The fraction of people who are non-college is shrinking over time. The fraction who are college is rising. So by 2016, about a third of all labor hours are supplied by people with high school or lower education. Another 30% by people with some college, and then another 40% by people with four-year college or above. So when you look at this, you can see that this polarization is primarily concentrated among people with high school or lower education. In other words, they have experienced a very dramatic decline in the middle, but it's mostly been picked up by a growth in employment in services, food service, cleaning, security, home health care, entertainment, recreation, cleaning, and some transportation as well. There's a little bit of polarization among college-educated workers, not as bad. So really, when you think about this phenomenon of this barbell, a lot of this is explained by the changing texture of work for less educated adults. They are increasingly moving out of what were traditionally office and production jobs and into service occupations. Now I want to show you how that relates to geography. I always pictured this phenomenon as being sort of a uniform, occurring everywhere, and it turns out that that's much less clear than I thought. So let me first start by pointing out how much the educational structure of places have changed. So you're going to see a bunch of figures that look like this. So let me take a moment to explain what they are. So these are groups of commuting zones. Commuting zones are clusters of counties that are something like a labor market. And I've ordered them according to population density. So it's a logarithmic scale, so each increment is a factor of 10. So starting on the left, you can think of there being rural areas, then suburbs, then metro areas, then cities. This figure just shows you the fraction of adults by commuting zone that have college or above education. And so you can see so several things to notice. First of all, this has risen over time dramatically as people become more educated. Second thing to notice is the slope has gotten much steeper. So in 1950, there was about a 5 percentage point difference in the fraction of adults who had college education in the most dense versus the least dense places. That didn't change much between 1950 and 1970. By 1980, it was 8 percentage points. As of 2015, it was 20 percentage points. So urban areas have become much, much more educated. They've really changed. So you might expect that the nature of work has also changed in urban areas. So I'm going to show that to you for college and non-college adults, but I'm going to start with the non-college adults. So this is data for 1970, and this is the fraction of non-college adults by commuting zone who are working either low-wage service occupations, as well as transportation production, middle wage, meaning production and clerical and sales, and high wage, meaning professional, technical, and managerial skill. So what you see is that in this period, there was this really steep gradient. As you moved into denser areas, your less educated workers were in some sense moving up an occupational ladder out of service jobs and manual jobs and into factories and offices, right? So they did something, and that's a difference of like 15 percentage points. So you could say there really was a difference in the type of work that non-college workers did in cities in 1970 to what they did in rural areas or even in suburbs. So I'm going to roll the clock forward by a decade, and you see a little bit of rotation of that axis. I'm going to roll it forward again to 1990, and you see further rotation. And now to 2000, and finally to 2015. And what you see is, first of all, there's almost no change in the share of non-college adults doing professional work, professional, managerial, technical. There's been no change in that whatsoever. What has happened is that the entire gradient of middle skill work done by non-college workers in cities is completely gone. It's just rotated away and been completely replaced by the same work that non-college adults have historically done in non-urban areas, meaning services, transportation, construction, repair. And so that's a really dramatic change. And so when I think about polarization, it's not that every place has lost the middle. It's that there was something distinctive about urban areas where less educated workers did arguably, were clearly better paid and arguably more skilled work, and that has gone away. That the work that is done by the less educated is now much more similar everywhere. And when I say more skilled, let me tell you why I think that. So what was special about these jobs in the middle? Well, they were jobs, if we're talking about office work or we're talking about manufacturing work, these were jobs where less educated workers were working in direct contact with highly skilled worker or highly educated workers in offices, in factories. They were sort of jointly producing something. This set of jobs are jobs where less educated adults may be serving the needs of more affluent individuals, but they're not really working in joint production. If you're driving, if you're cleaning someone's room, if you're serving them food, if you're driving them around, you're really not, kind of on the same team producing the same thing. So arguably, there was a different type of work going on there, and it is no longer the case. Let me show you the same figure for college workers, and I'm going to just do this in one panel because you'll see there's very little to see here, right? So the texture of work for more educated workers in this course category has changed very little. So we often think, I think it's a conceit that many of us academics have that, automation, computerization has just changed our lives. Our jobs are so different. But in fact, we still sit in the same offices and do the same type of work. We just use slightly different tools. For less educated adults, work really has changed enormously, right? The set of things that they, in which they were engaged, many of those things really have been automated or traded away. And there's a big set of residual activities, but they are in jobs that are historically low paid in service occupations. Why are those jobs historically low paid? You can give a variety of answers to that question, but one answer is many of those jobs use skills that are relatively generic. They're skills where you do the same thing on the end of the, after 10 years that you do in the first day in the job. And so people don't tend to have rising wages over time. They don't tend to have a lot of job security because employers see potential workers as interchangeable. And that's a very real concern. That's what we were talking about in the very first panel. How do we upskill work like that? How do we create those career trajectories? And let me show you this, more concretely. This just shows you for 1950, 1970, 1990, and 2015, the fraction of working age men and women who were working in production and administrative clerical jobs. And you can see that, as many of you will be aware, manufacturing used to be a very urban activity, right? It had to be urban because that's where the transportation networks were, that's where the railroad was, that's where the waterways were, that's where the good, where electrification was prevalent. Manufacturing has been fleeing cities for 100 years, but even in 1970, there was a lot of manufacturing outside of the densest places. Clerical work was steep and increasing population density, even up through the early 1980s, and then becomes totally flat. So there's now, among non-college workers, there's the prevalence of clerical work is no denser in downtowns than it is in the suburbs. That wouldn't be true if you looked at college-educated workers, but clerical work, as I'm sure you all understand, has changed, right? It's now a much more high-skilled work. It's much more about coordinating. It's much more about event organizing. It's much less about doing kind of routine paper information processing activities. So that decline in the middle really reflects primarily the decline of these two categories of work, one production work and the other clerical admin work. Okay, so that's the occupation structure, and say, well, how much does it matter? Well, you might have feelings about the type of work people do, but you might say, well, another thing you'd want to look at is wages. How is this related to changes in wages by education group across places? So this next set of figures shows you average wage levels for college and non-college workers across commuting zone using the same visual setup. And so let me call your attention to, if you look in 1970, you can see, and these are, again, the y-axis on the log scale here, so these are percentage point changes. In 1970, both college and non-college workers earned substantially more in cities than they did in metro areas, than they did in suburbs, than they did in rural areas. Now, that reflects a variety of things. That's not just the pure, it's not like when you move into a city, someone just hands you a, big packet of money and says, welcome to the city, higher wages, anything else. It reflects a number of things. One, of course, is that people have to be compensated to live in a city. It's more expensive. So in some level, wages have to be higher. But then, well, why do employers want to locate there? It must be more productive, right? And there's lots of evidence that says that cities are more productive, often because you have rapid exchange of ideas. you have a lot of innovative activity, you have kind of dense labor markets that allow you to find the skills you need, et cetera. So there are many reasons cities might be more productive. And so probably some of that higher wage premium reflected higher productivity in cities, not just higher cost of living. But notably, it was the same for college and non-college workers. In other words, non-college workers made less, but the premium was just as steep, reflecting that non-college workers were arguably doing more productive things in cities. And you say, well, why? Why did they need to be in cities? Well, one possible answer is highly educated workers are in cities because a lot of idea generation occurs in dense places. That's where the offices are, that's where the research is, fine. The clerical work, the manufacturing work that supported that needed to be where those people were, right? So it made sense to co-locate, that's where the productivity was, and so that could help understand that pattern. You look in roll the clock forward a decade, and you can see that not that much changes. Let's look forward to 2000. You can see that the blue line starts to rotate counterclockwise, meaning the urban premium seems to get steeper. And the red line rotates clockwise, meaning for non-college workers is going the other direction. Walk it forward another 15 years, and you see that this, again, the urban wage premium for the highly educated has grown steeper still, and for non-college workers, it's fallen by about 2/3. And that's quite a robust pattern, actually, that doesn't appear to be a simple artifact. It doesn't just start after the Great Recession. You can see it between 2000 and 2007. You can see it between 1990 and 2000. You can see it between 2007 and 2015. And let me just show you a couple more pictures of that. So this just adds in the 1950s. The important thing to see here is how much remarkable wage increase there was between 1950 and 1970, reflecting just the incredible post-war productivity boom. Also notably, it appears that wage inequality was actually lower in cities between high and low educated workers, whereas now it's much, much greater. It's also true if you look just among the young, so these people 25 to 39, or people 40 to 54, also young. And then moreover, you might say, well, isn't this a very coarse categorization? You're just doing college, non-college. People are changing. Non-college means more high school, less high school dropout than it used to. So this just shows you the same figure for 5 education groups: high school dropout, high school grad, some college, college grad, and then greater than college. And what you can see is for the high school grads and high school dropouts, the rotation is clockwise, and for people with college or post-college, it's counterclockwise. For some college, it's somewhere in the middle. So this appears to be really, I can't tell you, I can speculate on where this is coming from. I have not, I can't demonstrate the underlying causes, but I can tell you what it's not. It's not a simple, compositional shift in college versus non-college. It's not immigrants versus non-immigrants. These patterns are visible for both. So it does appear to be some change in the premium. The type of work, the return to that work for less educated workers in cities is changing. So that brings me to another component of this story, which is you might think, okay, well, if you were looking at this data, you would think, well, look, I can see cities are where educated people are. That's where high wages are for the highly educated. So maybe I would also, maybe if I were young and highly educated, that's where I would want to go. So in an ongoing work with Juliette Fournier, who's a PhD student at MIT, we've been sort of looking at this relationship between age structure and skills. And I'll point out a pattern that we found really stunning. This shows you the median age of population by US county, again, using the same density scale, from between 1950 and 2010. So the first thing to notice, in 1950, cities were about 5 years older at the median than were rural areas. And that would be true if you did it on average too. So there was a very robust, as you moved out of urban areas and into cities, people on average were getting older. You roll back forward 20 years, it's much more U-shaped, probably because people are moving towards the suburbs. Roll back forward to 1990, you see the average age of the population rises by about 4 years, right? That's the end of the baby boom, smaller cohort. So the US was pretty young by historical standards this period, now considerably older. But there's no gradient remaining in population density and age. And then by 2010, this is completely reversed, right? So cities are now 6 years younger. So one way to say this is between 1950 and 2010, rural areas aged by 12 years at the median, and cities aged by only 2. So that's so now you have sort of three facts about how urban areas have changed relative to non-urban areas. One is they're much more educated. Two, work is much more polarized. Right? You have a large cadre of highly educated, and then the remainder is doing a very distinctive and narrow set of occupations. And then they've gotten considerably younger. And you say, well, how could that happen? There's only sort of there's only four ways for that to occur, for the age structure to change. So the first one is a differential change in fertility, right? So fertility rises in cities, falls in rural areas. That would make them younger. Could have a differential change in mortality. You would have a lot more mortality in cities, and that would again have the effect of making them younger, assuming that mortality is among older citizens. It could be migration, change in pattern, and of course the fourth explanation would be alien abduction. If they selectively cull people according to age, that will also have the same effect. So we couldn't get data on the fourth. So looking at fertility, fertility has fallen considerably, but there isn't a big differential change. So this pattern is not driven by rising fertility in cities, falling fertility in rural areas. So the next thing we looked at was mortality. And it's actually really, what you'll notice is that this is age-adjusted mortality. So mortality used to be considerably higher in urban areas, and now is actually somewhat lower. And that reflects a variety of things. One thing is it reflects a decline in violence, but probably more importantly, it reflects rising education. Educated people just tend to lead healthier lives. So this is a really important change, but it certainly implies that mortality is not responsible for this pattern, because falling mortality in cities would actually tend to make them older. Right? So that leaves the third explanation, which is patterns of mobility by age. I won't delve into those in detail here, but what I will show you is just net migration across places. And what you can see, so just to explain what these triangles are, each of those is the percentage change in population. These sort of have to sum to zero if you sum across. So one place is losses, another place is gains. In 1970, you can see people were moving out of dense areas and into low density areas, out of cities, into suburbs, into rural areas. In 1980, that's still going on. In 1990, you see much more movement into the suburbs. In 2000, it just flattens out, and by 2010, the entire pattern of migration has just attenuated. So it's not that people aren't moving, although we know they're moving less, but it's just not nearly as directed. We don't see people moving out of cities and in net and into rural areas. And just to explain I don't have figures on this, but just a little more context. What's going on here is there's kind of a life cycle of mobility. If you look at the data, so people who were ages 0 to 17, young, are always tend to be moving out of cities and into suburbs and less dense areas because they're fleeing their families. So young people are moving out of cities because their parents are moving to places where there's more land, good schools. Right, the U.S. has uniquely bad schools in wealthy urban areas, and so that's a sort of natural pattern. If you look at then people who are 18 to 24, they tend to be moving back into dense areas, often for education. Historically, people who are 25 to 39 and 40 to 54 would then, after they move to dense areas for education, would then tend to move back out to the suburbs, right, where they would pursue their careers. But increasingly, they're not. They're much more likely to remain in cities. Maybe not the same city where they got education. They may move from Cambridge to the Bay Area or whatever, but they're tending to move into denser areas for education and then stay there. And so that is the biggest contributor to the declining age of cities, is that prime age adults who historically would have left dense areas to go to the suburbs and so on are staying there. Why are they staying there? Well, probably a few reasons. One is, of course, we see that that's where a lot of the high wage work is. Two, cities are just much better places to be, right? They're much safer, they have better food. And third, of course, people have fewer kids. So, which may be partly because they want to stay in cities, but your demand for space and good schools is going to be lower when you have smaller families. So what this means is this sort of changing texture of work. There's a lot of the work is urban, right? That's where our big population center is. A lot of the population and urban density has only risen, but it's changed in a really significant way, such that a lot of the jobs that we've been talking about today, when we talk about people doing food service, people doing security, people doing health aides, and so on, a lot of those people will be in cities, but they will be part of a structure of work where they are more bifurcated from the highly educated than they used to be, and the wage premium, at least as we can measure it, appears to be declining. So that the kind of economic benefit to being a city may not be nearly as large as it once was if you're not highly educated. So the traditional advice has always been, go to a city, that's where opportunity is, and that still appears to be true for highly educated, but it's not at all obvious that that's true for people without high levels of education. And maybe part of the decline in mobility that we see reflects people's recognition of this fact that actually the payoff to making that move may be falling if you don't have high levels of formal skills. So now let me relate this to new work. I've talked a lot about this polarization of work, and how does this relate to what's ahead? Well, as I said at the beginning of the talk, it's always tempting when someone says new work, the first thing that pops into your head, of course, is the kind of high-tech jobs of the future, whatever they are, but surely they involve machines and artificial intelligence, and you don't use your hands and whatever. And in this work, which is actually ongoing with Anna Salomons of Utrecht University, we were inspired by a paper by Jeff Lynn, published a number of years ago. Jeff is a vice president of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia at this point, and he had this very creative idea, which was to look through successive editions of the census occupational classification. So every decade, the Census Bureau releases a list of all their occupational titles. Not the ones that you'd find in the public use data set, which are about 600, but the fully itemized list, which is typically about 30,000 occupations. So they're incredibly detailed. And what's interesting about these is, well, how do they get these lists? Well, they ask people what they do, and they try to classify them under one of these titles. But if enough people say something they haven't heard before, they eventually create a new title. And so Jeff's idea was, well, this is a way of sort of measuring what are new activities. It's only one margin of job change, not all the job changes that occur. So Jeff's paper sort of focused on those high-tech jobs. If you look at the examples in his paper, it sort of shows you, the software engineers and the, precision scientists and radiological medicine and so on. Looking through this, I was actually a discussant of Jeff's paper many years ago, and I asked him for the full list of all the occupations. And what was striking about them is that many of them were those high-tech jobs, but there was another subset that was equally large that was not that category at all. So Anna and I, sort of going through this, thought it was useful to break this into what we see as three categories. This is arbitrary, and we're working on refining this, but one are the frontier jobs. So what's a frontier job? Well, here's some examples. So these are frontier jobs added to the Census Classified Index by decade. So in 1980, a frontier job might be a supervisor of word processing or a control of remotely piloted vehicles. In 1990s, those were circuit layout designers, robotic machine operators. In the 2000s, those would be chief information officers, echocardiographers, et cetera. And you can see the list. So these all make sense. And it's important to notice the frontier is always changing, right? So supervisor word processing, no longer a frontier job. Certainly there was a time when, 1970s, when being the copier guy was a frontier job. The next category that is at least as large and visible is what we call wealth work. These are jobs that don't really have any technological component per se, and certainly are not becoming more automated or more productive, but represent the kind of frontier of services and recreation that the highly educated demand, right? Or the affluent demand. So, in the 1980s, that was hypnotherapists and gift wrappers, the fingernail former, in 1990s, marriage counselors, baristas in 2000. Now, let me be clear, baristas were not invented in 2000, but that's when enough people reported to the Census Bureau that that's what they did for work, that they created this new category. horse exercisers, the ever-popular oyster preparer, and then in 2010, sommeliers. But I think, so why do I put these examples other than that they're amusing is because I think this is what many of the job opportunities that are being created are for people who are not college educated. These are an important and growing set of services. Finally, the last category, and this one's much more tenuous and harder to categorize, are what we call last mile jobs. These are jobs that are basically the kind of remaining husk of a formerly much more robust job that has been mostly automated away. Right? So the kind of canonical example of that at this point would be sort of the Amazon pick worker. Right? An Amazon pick worker used to be someone who would run through a warehouse in a tracksuit and pull things off shelves and then run up front and scan them and box them. Now an Amazon pick worker stands in place as robots bring shelves of objects to the worker. Laser pointers point at the thing on the shelf, they take it off, they put it in a box, and then off it goes. The reason that's a last mile job, of course, is first of all, most of it has been automated, and second, the rest of it will be automated not so long from now. Right? People typically lament bad quality of Amazon jobs, but it's also the case they will be ephemeral. 10, 15, 20 years, they almost surely will be fully automated, maybe faster. And you can see different examples, check writers, tamale machine feeders, vending machine attendants, and so on. And in fact, and many of these jobs, I should say, may occur outside of the United States, even though they're serving the United States. So if you think of people on Amazon MTurk or people who are on Upwork, many of these jobs would be data entry, they would be answering some phone calls, they would be recognizing images and faces and comparing them to photographs to verify whether they are or are not the same person. They might be going through chat rooms and deleting inappropriate content. And in fact, there's a very cool book called Ghost Work coming out shortly by Mary Gray and Siddhartha Suri of Microsoft Research that kind of talks about the quality of work in these sort of almost invisible jobs. So to summarize, so those are the examples. Let me try to characterize them statistically. So on the left-hand column shows you averages for all work in 2015. And then we try to break them down to frontier, wealth, and last mile jobs. So you'll see if you look at these frontier jobs, these kind of technological leading edge jobs, they're considerably higher paid than average. They are primarily done by men, so 72% of them, as opposed to 56% of the entire workforce. Half of them have people who have college degrees, and very few of them are done by high school graduates. Let me point out, these categories are small, right? These are all told, this is under 15% of all work. So I don't want to it's not that all work fits into any one of these categories. It's just the new work categories we look at. If you look at the wealth work, these are basically the services to the affluent. They pay about average. They're mostly done by women, and they're moderately more educated than the average job. And then these last mile jobs, which are much harder to identify, are comparatively low wage, about the same gender mix as the average, and considerably less educated. So 40% have high school or below. Just to show you what this looks like geographically, this shows you the fractions. So looking across urban areas, what you can see is both the frontier jobs and this wealth work, right, are both growing much more prevalent in cities. And if I were to break this down by gender, you would see, first of all, the wealth work is a larger category. Second of all, if we did it by gender, it'd be 4 times as large among women as among men. If we did it for men, we would find for frontier work the opposite pattern. And finally, just to look at wage levels, they kind of follow the pattern I've been discussing all along, which is that wages are higher in cities. They're highly bifurcated between these categories. And again, the high wages appear to be higher and concentrating in these kind of frontier jobs. So what should you take away from that? Well, the main thing I would take away from that is there's lots of new work, and this is only one measure of new work, but it's not all of a piece, right? It's not that all work is, have a PhD, or as many of my colleagues say, oh, you need to be, training neural nets by, middle school. I always find that extremely irritating, especially because my kids didn't do that. But the main takeaway is it looks a lot like other forms of work that have been growing, which they are very polarized. There's a component of it that's highly intellectual and highly cognitively skilled, and there's a lot of it that is a mixture of interpersonal interactions and dexterity and manual work. And that work is also growing, and we should be thinking about how we prepare people and how we make sure those jobs are good jobs if they will increasingly be the sector of employment for many adults looking forward. So to conclude, to set the stakes for, this is kind of the backdrop that I use to think about the labor market that we're increasingly facing. We see a lot of concentrating opportunities in superstar cities, but not for less educated workers. I think it's a really important change, and suggest that a lot of the kind of standard advice about what people ought to do is maybe somewhat out of date. The structure of non-metropolitan areas is changing much more slowly. The job structures, the skill structures, even the wage structures has not changed that much. What has changed is they've gotten much older. So that creates its own challenges. It also creates opportunity in the sense that it will create demand for workers to take care of the needs of older adults. So where is the work of the future? Well, it's a great time to be young and educated. It's always a great time to be young and educated. And so it's clear why young adults are moving to cities, why they're staying there, why that has so much even more attraction than it used to. It's not at all clear what the appropriate advice is any longer for less educated adults. Good advice is obviously to raise skills and look for opportunity, but broadly, where does that occur? It's not at all clear. In fact, it's quite possible that we're, at least when I look at the data, that we're in something of a disequilibrium, where wages are actually not high enough in cities anymore to compensate less educated adults for being there. They're there, they've been there historically, but it may be that the better return is to move to somewhere where cost of living isn't so high and wages are relatively comparable. And finally, I think this question of changing geographic mobility, changing the mobility across jobs, I think it's a really complex phenomenon, and some of it perhaps reflects increasing frictions, bad information, but part of it may also be changing incentives. That part of the decline in mobility of more educated adults is that they're going to cities and staying there as opposed to moving out again. And perhaps part of the reason that less educated adults are moving less frequently to cities, as has been emphasized in work by Danny Shoag and Peter Ganong, is that it's not just that those places are getting expensive, but the pay premium to that work is also is just not there. I don't want to I sound so somber here. The good news is you can always get your oysters prepared in the city. No, the good news is I think the good news about all this, something that makes me much more optimistic about all this is the changing demographics are very much more favorable to the less educated at this point, or will be going forward. Why? Because we have tremendous demands for service work. We'll have relatively few young people to do that work. And education levels are rising very rapidly right now, both high school completion and college going, which means there'll be greater competition for people willing to do this work. So there's the opportunity is, I think, to figure out how to successfully, productively take those scarce set of people and make them as productive, as use their skills and their time as well as we can. So I hope in thinking about the initiative that we're embarking on, what a really big target to keep in mind is jobs that work well for people without high formal levels of education. For people with high formal levels of education, probably the labor market's working quite well. For others, looking for that work that creates a career trajectory, that creates stability, that creates a sense of, possibility of economic security over some enduring period of time, that's what I hope we will find improving solutions for creating. So thank you very, very much for your time.
You have like 5 minutes if you want to take questions.
Sure.
I'm going to ask this question of you because I've had it kind of every panel, but
Yeah.
you're the last guy. So what about emerging industries, right? Like climate change, it suggests that there's going to be some new jobs related to adaptation in cities. Whether we're there yet or not, it seems like impossible that won't happen in the future. The cannabis industry, right? These are emerging industries where there is a possibility of solutions at a micro level, maybe not solutions that are big enough to change your trend lines, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on emerging industries like that.
Well, I mean, I think there's going to be, more broadly, even without emerging industries, there's going to be tremendous labor demand in traditional construction and other, we're not going to run out of work in the trades or a lot of blue collar work for a very, very long time. Those things will continue to be both labor intensive and skill intensive. But I agree, of course, there will be new opportunities in some of these other sectors. I don't think, it's a historical problem is we don't know how to create lots of new jobs that don't require a lot of specialized skills, right? So in the 1930s, right, during the New Deal, it was quite possible to just send a lot of people to dig ditches and build things without very high levels of training and certification. But now, construction is a very skilled, capital-intensive activity. You can't just set people to work doing those kind of things. Ironically, one of the few really big new job creation things that we've seen, in addition to pick workers, would be driving for Uber or Lyft. Right? That's actually the closest thing we have in the U.S. to workfare, meaning that you can just any day of the week, you can just get in your car and earn by the hour without a lot of credentialing. So, where the government has tried to look for opportunities to create mass amounts of jobs, as they did, for example, with weatherization and so on during the Great Recession, they've had limited success. So hopefully some of this, retrofitting, adaptation, but even if we were just to actually, for example, maintain our infrastructure, that would also create a lot of employment. I'm not sure that answers the question, but my best effort.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm interested in kind of the accumulation of wealth. And I think a lot of the research around kind of opportunity and mobility is looking at income. And obviously a lot of the kind of implications of the research you presented today around kind of labor categories is also kind of related to income too. But obviously we've also seen a kind of greater concentration of wealth over the same period. And people are more likely to go on to get kind of post-secondary education if they do come from wealthier backgrounds, etc. So I just wondered if you had any kind of insights into that. Obviously, it's a harder thing to measure or observe, I think. But just wondering if you kind of thought about the interaction there.
Yeah. So I haven't done any of the important research on the concentration of wealth. Obviously, that has occurred. But I think you tied to something that I do think is really first order and amenable policy, more so than wealth concentration even, which is mobility. Right? You said families of the affluent, are much more likely to go on for higher levels of education, and that's true. But that's also something that is very amenable to policy. There have been successful experiments for creating opportunity for kids who are not from wealthy families, not from fancy school systems, to go for higher education, and that will have enormous effects on mobility. So, when I think about what am I most concerned about in kind of the structure of U.S. economy is, wealth, I guess, income, I guess, but really opportunity and the likelihood that people of given talent get to realize that talent. And, in many ways, we think this country, is, a great meritocracy from the median on up. And then below that, there's just an enormous amount of inequality of opportunity that really prevents people from, realizing whatever potential that they have. They don't get the health investments. They don't get the educational investments. They don't get, selected and invested in and picked up. And so that's a problem that we have a lot of good social policy tools for. There's something we're using them all, right? But we've been much more experimental, for example, in K through 12 education and in charter schools and improving schools, not at necessarily great expense, but getting much better outcomes, or funding scholarship programs and counseling programs and early career talent recognition programs that take kids who, in every sense, belong in the best schools and get them there. So I think that, in some sense, seems to me a problem that that we surely know how to make progress on, that will help work against this gradient, and that we can experiment with to learn about. So I'm optimistic that there's a toehold there, although it in no sense resolves the wealth concentration problem that you raised.
I think, sorry, if you want to make your flight to Australia,
Oh.
I think we're going to have to
I don't think I can walk. Okay. Well, thank you all very, very much, and congratulations, Jay Powell. Thank you to Toby and for all of you for contributing to this initiative. Thank you.